I've been away for a while. Let's get into the video. Patience Zena quickly skyrocketed to YouTube fame and infamy stemming from her first viral video on the Little Mermaid remake. In it, she questioned the intentions behind both the Disney Corporation's motives for changing the races of characters as well as people, especially people of color's, willful acceptance of it. She received several critiques and criticisms from the online left, mainly creators like Noah Samsen and Princess Weeks, who never directly named Patience in her video, but it was pretty clear that was her target. These critiques revolve around several points that I will address in detail during this video. The idea of the alt-right pipeline, meaning Patience is a gateway to conservative politics, the art of grifting, or intentionally framing political ideas in a manner that is meant to be misleading or enticing to a particular audience of people, and lastly, the resurrection of the never-ending debate surrounding political moderates and centrists. Noah Samsen's critique on Patience garnished a lot of attention because Patience herself responded to him directly with her central arguments that he had an American-centric political bias, as well as her accusations of allyship only being offered under false pretenses and riddled with stipulations to people of color.
That content will help them develop this conservative, anti-woke disposition.
This is the first time that Noah reveals his true intentions with this video, when he starts to mention things like conservatism and how he dislikes people who have anti-woke rhetoric. You should not become obsessed with these left-wing and right-wing labels, and why I say you should avoid echo chambers and you should expose yourself to different views. If you are a left-winger, you should expose yourself to right-wing views. If you are a right-winger, you should expose yourself to left-wing views for a number of reasons. That is what many of us minorities are to these white liberals, is just pawns in their political game.
I created a video specifically analyzing that discourse if you are at all interested in learning more. Before we get into the primary arguments presented by both leftist creators and my leftist audience members, I would like us to first deconstruct Patience's general argumentation on her channel. Patience uses a style of arguing that is common in bipartisan politics, meaning that this is a style that both the left and the right employ. She presents an issue, states her opinion on the matter while somewhat entertaining alternative perspectives, but sets up the counter-argument in a manner in which she is strongly insinuating to her audience that it had no value or true meaning. Because the counter-argument is not presented in any significant or analytical manner, she is able to ignore the possible falters within her own, but can still be seen as good-faithed by her audience. An example here would be her video titled "Muslim Mother Pleads Activists Not to Hurt Her Kids." She begins the video by stating that she will not touch on the Muslim creator's ideas or controversies because she wants to focus on the unreasonable hate being sent her way, including but not limited to alleged threats on her children's lives.
So I just got an email saying, pretty much a threat, saying they know where I live. And what scares me the most is they have got my daughter's details on the email.
Now, I'm not going to be naming the content creator who posted that video or her social media handles, because I don't really want to focus this video too much on her because of the harassment that she's been receiving for speaking out on this topic. However, I do think it's really important for us to still talk and address the situation, because I do think this is a much bigger problem. Part of that problem is our obnoxious obsession with identity labels, as well as the grotesque fear tactics that some people will use on people who they dislike or they disagree with. So the creator made some videos voicing her concerns about the content being made by another content creator named Jeffrey Marsh. Jeffrey Marsh has been criticized by several people at this point because their content appears to be aimed at children.
The framing of the topic at hand, which ends up just being the weaponization of identity politics, is hypocritical, and it also shows me that she either elevates herself above leftists or she genuinely does not see how she is utilizing identity politics by setting up what I like to call a perpetual victim. Even by the title of this very video, Patience utilized the Muslim creator's identity to signal to audience that she, a marginalized woman of color, is being victimized by the internet, specifically stemming from a white person or an issue dealing with a white person. That alone is enough to arise feelings of apprehension and disgust in people. But at the end of the day, outside of people's out of line and reactionary, xenophobic, and racist comments towards the threatened creator, this discourse had nothing to do with the creator being Muslim. It had everything to do with the things that she says and supports. And because people like to play games, let me clearly state that no, disagreeing with someone's politics or rationale shouldn't lead to threats of physical violence, especially towards children. Stating that does not negate the intended nature of Patience's framing of the topic, nor does it remove the insidious manner in which Patience used that creator as a shield to backlash she might have received for stating some of the things that she did in the video. The way it works out is like this. Patience does not engage with the Muslim creator's words head on, rather she says that this video is not about her. It's about the normalization of the harassment going towards her. But in truth, the video is not about either of those things. It was actually about attacking protected classes of people because she has the perception that these groups levy more power in society because some people a part of these groups are irrational, chronically online, and probably need to be in jail. In doing so, she's setting up a way to make people connect with the thought of, if you bring up the transgressions of this Muslim creator or defend against the accusations of grooming by this other creator or defend these people groups at all, you are denying this woman, this marginalized woman, her victimhood in this terrible situation.
Because who would have ever thought that a white male would have more social capital than the South Asian Muslim woman? Who would have thought? Could this be the infamous white privilege I've heard so much about? No. This feels more like alphabet privilege. What is it with these modern activists and their amazing skill at causing more problems than they fix? We've got black activists creating more racism, and then we've got the LGBT plus activists who are causing the decline in LGBT acceptance. Oh, you didn't know about that? Well, apparently since around 2016, LGBT plus acceptance has been declining. And given how skilled you have to be to make the youngest generations within society become less tolerant of you.
Just wanted to slide in here and correct some misinformation here. I've located the articles Patience was more than likely referencing in her video, not because they were in her description box, but because Google is a relatively easy tool to use. Each article, as well as several others, is referencing a singular 2018 study published by GLAAD, which is a reputable organization, as far as I can tell, that is focused on uplifting the queer community. The baseline statement of Patience's thesis is that there is a decline in the acceptance of the queer community from younger generations, meaning those between the ages of 18 and 34, and she believes this is because of the activists. Because the articles are from 2019, the best way I believe I can evaluate this statement from Patience in present-day context is by starting with GLAAD's most recent study published in 2021 and working my way backwards. Looking at the 2021 study alone, that is an interpretation of the results, but I wanted to tell you guys how I read the information. GLAAD reported that there is more awareness of gender identity comparatively to 2020, but there is also still a large amount of confusion and unfamiliarity around the topic, as should be expected. I hold no expectations for people to just accept something that they do not understand. However, what calls GLAAD's concern is the increased amount of discrimination towards the queer population, as well as people's general apprehension towards introducing more LGBTQ history in schools, and so on and so forth. One interpretation given the results would be a correlation between increased awareness and the increased discrimination and targeted crimes towards the queer population, particularly trans people, especially when you compare the 2021 results to their 2016 study where there was increased acceptance, but there is also an unawareness or ambivalence towards LGBTQ, so it adds more validity to the interpretation that GLAAD presented. However, it is worth noting that there was a sharp and abrupt decline in comfort and personal interactions with the community in 2017. One thing I would critique the most recent study for is not clearly outlining what classifies as discrimination, because there can be a shift from person to person on as to what discrimination actually is, especially when it comes to self-reporting. Another criticism I would have would be removing the percentages that classify it by gender or sex, ally or resistor, etc. I think they may have disserviced the study by removing important details that they used to offer in older studies. I personally believe those identifiers added more context. But When you look at GLAAD's 2018 release that compares the results from 2014 through 2017, there's an evident decrease in the support for the community. To evaluate this statistic, we're going to need to add more background. And the background is that that time period was so turbulent in the United States. Not quite just because of the legalization of gay marriage at the federal level in 2015, but because there is also a spike in the foolishness of the online left. Here I'm referring to the weird demonization of the gaming community by radical feminists. I'm referring to the increased militance towards language centered around identities that most Westerners have never heard of. There was a lot of childish, thoughtless takes from the online left at the time, which in turn gave more rise to the alt-right. Make no mistake, the alt-right has always been around. They were just a bit more quiet during the Obama administration. The radicalism of the online left during this time did polarize and jade people to their cause, and it also inadvertently gave way to the polar opposite of that radicalization to exist more freely. In these conversations, people sometimes like to frame it as if the left and activists solely caused their own issues and increased discrimination because of the thoughtlessness that sometimes came from them. And while I obviously believe this to be true, it's only to a certain extent. Much like any other identity group, acceptance of the LGBTQ community in the West has always been conditional. And I'm not referring to conditional in a reasonable sense. I'm referring to the fact that they are and were accepted with the stipulation of them shutting the fuck up and keeping it in the bedroom. That is why I believe there was a perception of increased acceptance in the year 2015, because people were simultaneously underexposed to the LGBTQ community. So the LGBTQ community was still just a concept to most, not actually people they saw and interacted with on a daily basis, thereby better enabling them to ignore their unconscious biases and prejudice. Just because the discrimination was quieter does not mean it was not there. Alongside the online ridiculousness of the left in 2014 to 2018, there were also many queer people unrelated to direct politicking that decided to live more freely and express themselves more unapologetically. And that action was met with repulsion and disgust, as in to say, how dare you be queer and proud and happy, you degenerate? Just because I believe the online left kind of initially fucked the general queer community with their militance, I also believe it was necessary and inevitable. The LGBTQ community deserves to live as their authentic selves without being forced into easy to understand categories. And to do that, you have to drag the spotlight to yourself and take a stand. When you spotlight yourself, your life, and experiences, you should always expect backlash. And while some of that backlash will be radical, we should also simultaneously expect a growth period. And I do think that is where we are right now in 2023. And I don't know why people actually believe progress looks like the drawing Patience did in one of her videos, but it doesn't. Progress is messy, inconsistent, and never completed because we've never been in the place that we are currently in. Progress wanes and flows, it spikes, it dips, it remains stagnant at times. That is the way it has always been and probably always will be. It's just easier to see it as a never-ending incline or an incline with a steep drop down like Patience presents, depending on what your biases are and what levels your awareness and education are on. In America, we were once told that we need to make this country great again, but every minority, every marginalized group was like, and when the fuck was this nation ever great? It's all about perspective. If you think social progress is done and good to go, it's because you're lacking it. As I said so many times before on my channel, I understand the ambivalence towards the left, but I will never support turning that ambivalence onto the marginalized. They are not one and the same. Moving on, I did want to point out that one of the sources Patience cited was from an evangelical Christian website who had this to say on the topic. Living the LGBTQ lifestyle leads to slavery to sin. It does not give the freedom that it promises. Freedom for any person is found in repentance and putting your faith and trust in Christ alone for salvation. Then the Son, Jesus Christ, will set you free from the yoke of slavery and give you new and eternal life. That's the message this culture desperately needs to hear. Now, there's nothing on Patience's channel that indicates to me that she would support this blatantly of a hateful message, so I'll simply remind you all that this is why you should always check your sources instead of just snipping whatever article headline that seems to fit your point. It is also why transparency and sourcing from creators who claim to do research and deep dives is paramount. When a creator cites studies or statistics and they don't link them in their description boxes, or they don't show you on screen what the information is it's being pulled from, your red flag should immediately start to wave. The last thing I wanted to address in this tangent is the following comment.
I do sometimes find myself wondering, what exactly are these activists fighting for? What is their cause?
Well, she actually answered her own question with one of the articles she cited. There has been increases in hate crimes, not just towards the LGBTQ population, but racial groups as well as ethnic groups like the Jewish. What world are you living in, Patience? Because the one I live in, under the rug, is stained with the blood of the marginalized. In essence, she is using identity politics to attack identity politics, and does so very badly. But it doesn't matter to her audience, because her audience is vocally made up of people who believe things like this or believe worse things than this. You cannot utilize identity politics to say that identity politics are bad. I mean, I guess you can, because she clearly did, but your argument would just be
Profoundly unconvincing.
When someone claims to be a person who operates outside of the binary political spectrum while weaponizing and utilizing parts of that political system, they can be seen as dishonest or using their claimed operants as a way to circumvent addressing their own biases, whether they be directly politically related or not. Patience has a strong bias against the online left. That bias exists because she, as she states, dislikes lazy argumentation, pandering, and the assertion that leftist ideology should guide and dictate society. She holds a perspective that the extremism that exists within bipartisanism is what is damaging the political system and structure. She holds that her opinions seem more moderate because she approaches each side of the conversation with logic and an understanding of reality, and that reality is that most people offline do not fall into either extreme of the political left or the political right.
Contrary to what a lot of people on the far right say, or what a lot of people on the far left say, I do actually believe the left and the right can coexist. The far right and the far left detest each other. In fact, they actively want to destroy each other because in their worldview, there is no way that they can coexist. But people who are closer to the center and more moderate in their views, center-left people and center-right people, are able to get along just fine. And this is why I don't buy the narrative that the culture war is about the left and the right. The culture war is actually about the far left and the far right, and they're also very, very set in their ways, and therefore they're not open to hearing out their opposition. These are the two sides that are causing the polarizations, and in some cases radicalizing the people who were previously moderate.
For leftists, this type of rhetoric tends to ring as more right-leaning, since it can be perceived as a refusal to show support towards marginalized people groups because Patience wants to hear out the right. And the right has historically and modernly set a precedent that they do not care and will not support marginalized groups unless they meet XYZ criteria, like very specific criterias that are often bigoted and harmful and go against that person's identity as a whole. From a leftist perspective, the inability to denounce the right while constantly critiquing the left, the rejection of engaging with the discourse that comes from the right and that exists in rightist spaces, the constant objection of things that they believe are correct moral principles is a show of support for the right without directly labeling oneself as a rightist. Now, when engaging with people who lean right, the leftist arguments of morality, of ethics, of empathy will not suffice. For example, if a right-leaning centrist is questioning the notion of providing more funding to social service projects like Section 8 housing in the United States, leftists often automatically go into malequent arguments of systemic oppression and love thy neighbor rhetoric. Leftists have a tendency to start very big and very broad, when what is often needed for centrists is the baseline and a way to relate the grander issue to themselves as an individual. One could argue that this is a selfish perspective, but it is a more realistic, common, and poignant one. This is why many on the left hold the perspective that centrists and political moderates are just conservative, because this type of self-focused and self-involved outlook often aligns more with the social requirements of capitalism than the communal tenets of socialism. The left often fights on the scale of community and identity groups, while conservatives and centrists lean more in favor of a more or libertarian outlook, which greatly favors the idealized individual. This is consistent with Patience's own analysis. She demonstrates a frustration towards the left for constantly abandoning the individual. That frustration is not unique. The quick categorizations of many within the online left have frustrated me as well, and still do. A good example here would be the never-ending battle between leftist debaters like Vosh and Destiny and leftist video essayists like FD Signifier or Noah Sampson. This is an example of infighting, of course, but each time one side discusses the other, there's labels of racism and idiocy being levied against one another because of certain perspectives that they all hold. They quickly and succinctly write each other off into inescapable case without room for growth. Likewise, when someone has an English accent or someone who sounds slightly English to the American ear, they are often categorized as a TERF from TERF Island. This is an effect that comes from locking yourself within spaces where people not only think like you, but act in similar manners as you do. The reason that this section is titled Conservative Identity Politics is not because I really want to sit here and dissect each and every argument of Patience when it comes to any type of identity. It is because I want to discuss her levying identity as a way to add validity to her arguments that are normally quite surface level. In the video titled, Our Society is Full of Hypocrites, she discusses the hypocrisy of more progressively minded people, laughing at an interview clip of Jordan Peterson where he becomes emotional. The video is a quick one, just naming common hypocrisies found within the unnamed online leftist hemisphere. In each example, she brings up a political identity, from trans people and women to the Black community. And in each one, she names a common hypocritical stance, or what she sees as a hypocritical stance.
But because you disagree with a man's politics, you think he's free game for you to mock and ridicule and call him a little girl, or say that you think he's taking estrogen. And so basically reinforcing the same gender stereotypes that you claim to be working so hard to fight against. These are the same people who will say things like, we need to uplift the voices of Black women, unless of course that Black woman is someone like Candace Owens. It's all about screaming about representation and how we need to have Black voices, unless those Black voices are conservative. Then you can call them a coon and Uncle Tom and every racial slur you want to, because they disagree with your politics, so now they're free game. These are also the same people who say that they stand for trans people and believe in trans rights, unless of course that trans person is, say, a Blair White or a Buck Angel or a Caitlyn Jenner or anyone who doesn't agree with their agenda. The same people who say that we need to have more women in charge because that would be better for societies, while simultaneously being adamantly against the woman who's about to become the Prime Minister of Italy because she believes in more conservative values. So all of this tells me that the people who claim to care so much about women or ethnic minorities or LGBT people or men's mental health don't really truly care about that because they're not very consistent.
You see, this is actually interesting because we, as in Patience and I, do not necessarily disagree on this. I've said multiple times on my channel that I've observed self-proclaimed leftists using stigmatized language towards marginalized people who lean right. However, the apparent difference between my opinion and from what I can glean from Patience based on her content is I don't believe that all opinions are of equal value. And that doesn't mean that I don't support freedom of speech. I support your freedom to be an asshole. I just also support my freedom to call you an idiot for it. The only reason I believe the online left should engage with the argumentation of figureheads like Blair White, Candace Owens, or even Ben Shapiro is to understand where the failings of the political left are. There is a reason why marginalized people turn their backs on the left. And you guys need to understand why. When a pattern continues to emerge amongst people of specific identities, it is worthy of a societal level discussion. The only reason I believe people should listen to the arguments presented by those who are overtly bigoted on the right is because the online left needs to actually understand the arguments in order to construct a significant response. In other words, stop relying on your biases and assumptions of the right in order to battle with them. The right has evolved their rhetoric with the times, with the adoption of figureheads and revised arguments surrounding a perpetual victim. The right has also co-opted the argumentation of empathy in some ways that really should sicken you.
Now, none of this means that anybody suffering from gender dysphoria ought to be mistreated. Anybody with any sort of disorder ought to be treated with nothing but sympathy and care. But this does mean that a society that seeks to propagandize to children that they can switch their gender is both lying to kids and doing them psychological harm in the process.
And the left is now only starting to catch up with that. In summary, the distinction between Patience's opinion of the left and my own is that I don't believe the right has a point. And if they do make a decent argument, it is typically accidental, or it shows a disingenuous concern that is made up to purely highlight the weird radicalism that pops up kind of frequently in leftist spaces. In addition to functioning as a gotcha moment towards leftists, this tactic demonstrates the perceived irrationality of certain leftist rhetoric, causing people to be critical and subsequently question their political alignment before an alternative argument has even been presented. Like many right-leaning people here on the YouTube platform, Patience employs identity politics with one of the sole purposes of trying to hold the online left to an impossible standard that, in fairness, they've created for themselves. It's pretty hard to constantly spawn arguments upon the basis of empathy and then consistently show none towards your opposition. It is hypocritical, but that is surface level. Hypocrisy is the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to political argumentation. The reason why figures like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson are belittled or made fun of in certain leftist contexts is to remove any seriousness or validity from these characters. The things that they often say are just plainly bigoted and outright absurd. And at a certain point, you can no longer expect the average leftist Twitter commenter to care about thoughtfully engaging with their actual ideas. That's what commentators and video essayists are here for, actually, in a lot of ways. We take on the burden of listening to the insufferable drivel and make it palatable for our audiences. And you guys should always double check us too, because we are all biased. Patience utilizes identity politics only with the end goal of undermining the left. Now, this statement in and of itself is still neutral to me at this point, because what she is doing is utilizing the standards that many on the left has set for themselves. And that's fine. Where it becomes a bit more insidious is when she insinuates that there is validity and purpose to identity politics, like suggesting that representation is important, but then goes on to undermine them when it suits her fancy, much like the example I used previously with the Muslim TikTok creator. In this particular video, Patience attempts to undermine Imran Anton's argument of the very unfortunate murder of Tyre Nichols having a link to white supremacy, or as I would more appropriately title it, a connection to racial unconscious bias, internalized racism, and of course, systemic racism. In stating that the political commentator cannot hold the individual policeman involved with the incident whilst analyzing the issue from a more societal level, Patience shows either her inability to understand how to break down complexities within situations as they relate to large-scale societal issues, or her rejection of the concept of systemic issues in general.
Personally, this is about an abuse of power and a disregard of human life, and those individuals need to be accountable for their actions. That I need to
Don't disagree. What's it got to do with racism and white supremacy?
So people
Why are
also,
white people responsible for this?
Okay, so people could also argue that this is due to internalized racism, which is a byproduct of societal or institutional racism, also referred to as white supremacy.
So black police officers become white supremacist racists who kill black people because they work in an atmosphere of white supremacy. Is that it?
But then later on, she goes on to blame this on white supremacy. That's not how you hold someone accountable. If you're ever shifting blame onto something else or someone else, then by definition, you are not holding that person accountable. What these police officers did to Tyre Nichols was disgusting, and they should be held accountable for doing that. Also, the argument as well that the reason why these black men did what they did to Tyre Nichols because they work for the police force, and the police force is run by white supremacy, and this white supremacist institution is what's causing them to essentially be brainwashed into wanting to kill black people. If white supremacist institutions are what motivate black people to kill each other, how do you explain the countless number of young black men who are either stabbed to death or shot in the street by each other? What institution of white supremacy is motivating them to kill each other?
As a quick tangent, in the United States, our legal and socio-political structures are all based on principles of separation, whether that be race, class, nationality, or what have you. As much as more conservatively minded individuals like to ignore historical context, those who collaborated to establish our government and its laws all held positions of power through their status and wealth. The document that so many hold near and dear to their hearts, the Constitution, was penned by those powerful individuals who were so intrinsically disconnected from the minority groups and minority opinions that many of them wrote of the importance of the pursuit of individualistic happiness and freedom while owning slaves, while profiting from the backs of exploited laborers, while digging their heels into stolen land. This is not just hypocrisy or a product of the time. It is the dissonance between one's spoken ideals and what values one demonstrates through their self-serving actions. This dissonance has carried on throughout the construction and development of the United States, as seen in every branch of our government, primarily the legislative and judicial branches, that have limited the value and rights of migrants and refugees, LGBTQ, religious groups outside of the conventional Christian denominations, and so on and so forth. The only way for this inconsistency in ideals to continuously be passed down from the wealthy and powerful to the poor and disadvantaged is by pushing the idea of the individual, as in you as the individual has the freedom, the duty, and the power to become who and what you want to be as long as you work hard enough. The concept of the American dream is framed in such a way that it seemingly uplifts the individual, but equally it covertly absolves our society of its false and oppressive systems. People have worked themselves to literal death to achieve this great American dream of grandeur. People have broken their backs, have broken their children's spirits to live up to the individualized notion of success. If we are taught that notability through success determines our personal worth, which is a ubiquitous belief in our capitalistic society, we will take heed of those who are wealthy and powerful, not those who understand firsthand the system that propagates struggle. Thus, the ideals that uphold this system are passed down to and inadvertently perpetuated by those who suffer from it, not just those in power. When do we acknowledge that there is something fundamentally broken within our systems, that this is a reality for most Americans? Or are we all just individual failures? Taking this back to patience. To undermine the value of socio-political or socio-economic connections to events like the killing of Tyre Nichols is to undermine any academic, scientific, or scholarly evaluation on how to cause progress. She refers to the acknowledgement of internalized bias as infantilizing.
I do think that a lot of the rhetoric that some of these people say is so infantilizing to Black people, and it's also quite degrading. I remember having the same situation on my TikTok when I spoke about colorism, and I was saying how modern day colorism in Black cultures is perpetuated by Black people. If you speak to darker skinned Black people and you ask them who has ever picked on you or made fun of you or made you feel insecure about your complexion, I would bet my savings that they would say to you the vast majority of the people who did that to them were Black. And I was trying to raise this conversation on my TikTok, which was that why do we do this to each other? Why do we make fun of each other's features? Why do we put each other down for our skin tones and how light we are, how dark we are, or what our hair texture is like, or how we choose to have our hair, whether we choose to have it natural, whether we choose to have weaves or whatever. The people who do all this shaming and stuff, the vast majority of the time are Black themselves.
But conditioning is pinnacle to human interaction and behavior, which is something that I would think that she, as someone who values approaching topics from a purely biological perspective at times, would appreciate.
So I've had some people express on my channel before that they take issue with the fact that I explain human behavior through biological means, like through evolutionary biology and stuff, because they feel like I'm basically saying that humans are essentially animals. And in response to those people who feel that way, my answer to that is, yeah, because human beings are animals. I honestly think that a contributing factor to the problems that we have today in society is that people now attribute things that we once understood to be biological to sociological constructs or social conditioning. The reality is human beings are animals.
Which, by the way, is an oversimplified and inaccurate way to evaluate the human condition. Colorism, at least in the West, comes from the desire to achieve some sort of desirability or proximity to mainstream white society. This proximity can lead to increased stability and protection. That is why it is South. It was a mean of survival and adaptation to a society that does not value you. Patience states colorism has now evolved and is perpetuated by Black people, which I do agree with. But this is with the caveat of understanding why it is something Black people do. Psychologically, sociologically, and anthropologically, when society is touched by an invader, and that invader obtains and maintains power and wealth within that society, if that society is not liberated, the society in question in future generations will hail to the principles and standards set by that invader because they are the ones in power, the ones who conquered. This is not unique to the West. It is observable within the times of the Japanese Empire. But that is not to say that we have not come to a point in Western society where we really do need to begin to remove those shackles from our perceptions. Patience then goes on to conflate societal evaluations with individual evaluations. She emotionally demands why we, as in the Black community, still do this to each other. Why can't we just uplift one another and change our behaviors towards one another without turning to slavery or white supremacy as an explanation?
Why do we make fun of each other's features? Why do we put each other down for our skin tones and how light we are, how dark we are, or what our hair texture is like, or how we choose to have our hair, whether we choose to have it natural, whether we choose to have weaves or whatever? The people who do all this shaming and stuff, the vast majority of the time are Black themselves. And I think it's important for us to have a conversation about that, because we can't in one breath say that we want to uplift each other while simultaneously being the main ones who put each other down. But when I tried to have that conversation, there were people in there saying, yeah, well, this is because of years ago, white people, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, I don't care.
Why indeed? Understanding the roots or origins of a behavior is the first step to overhauling said behavior. Socially speaking, humans use observation to adapt. If there is a pattern of behavior that seemingly uplifts one's survival, it is likely that one will employ this method even if it hurts the group that they are a part of. Granted, it may be difficult for a right-leaning person to see why these contradictions arise. After all, many conservative ideals focus on individual responsibility. So when honing in on society's shortcomings, it's easy for a hyper-individualistic person to overlook the mechanisms that push people into enacting unsavory behaviors. It must be acknowledged that it is normal for people's actions to contradict their beliefs. No one is immune to this, left or right, but it's easier to point out the external factors that may vindicate your own inconsistencies while ignoring the invisible forces that tug on those you deem as contemptible. In the end, it is all a matter of perspective. We may all be hypocrites, but when ego gets involved, it's clear to see why things are unjust, why you are pushed into a corner and forced to do something you otherwise would not want to do. However, for everyone else, everyone you don't understand, they're just making excuses. This way of thinking is mankind's greatest and most pervasive hypocrisy. Bringing it to a more individual level, most people do not have the emotional intelligence to understand their own behaviors or how to actually meaningfully change them that truly alters their subconscious thinking. It's easy to acknowledge the external factors that influence your behaviors without turning these realizations into a practical blueprint that improves your daily functioning. It's the difference between pointing out the problem and coming up with a solution. The latter is much more difficult than the former, and we're not given the tools early in life to facilitate our success in this regard. This is why the fields of psychology are very necessary, and it is also why centrists and conservatives need to stop pretending that humans are nothing but animals. Our frontal lobes and our ability to think past our initial instincts is so profound, so extraordinary, that these people take it for granted just so they can sell a simplified, modified simplified version of humanity that suits their own beliefs. It is much easier to fall into a conservative line of thinking when you follow overly simplistic arguments that regulate people to our biology alone. Regardless, Patience inadvertently answers many of her own questions at times. She states that many Black people contribute too much to white people, and this is very much true. But the reason that this occurs is because of institutionalized racism. How can the vast majority of people know what is true or more holistic when schooling is skewed in favor of a certain narrative? That narrative being one that undervalues people of color and their achievements. That narrative being one that only highlights easy to understand plights and tribulations of people of color, but simultaneously never once painting them as complex human beings with differing thoughts and ideas. We gotta acknowledge that public schools are funded by the state with curriculum that is established by the state. So it should be of no surprise that said curriculum upholds a certain idealized image of the country. All of the faults of America are acknowledged as problems of the past only, and those who fought for the foundational rights of marginalized groups are added to a collage of visages, meaning a medley of exceptional people, hateful or not, who touched America and made it the great nation that it is today. No foul is actually acknowledged. Instead, the image of freedom fighters from disparaged backgrounds are subtly placed beside and likened to those who helped establish the very systems they fought against. Because in America, its founders are a symbol of freedom, and we cannot contradict that in schools. No. Thus, we absorb the image of Black revolutionaries, abolitionists, and civil rights activists as yet another symbol of American freedom alongside the originals. To be American is to fight injustice like our forefathers did, even if those forefathers were the very perpetuators of that oppression. In order to expand this type of understanding without relying on the primary schooling systems, you must go out of your way to learn and explore, something that so many people do not have time to do because they are just trying to live, which unfortunately leads to the cycle continuing. One more thing about this video before we move on. She states that people, I'm assuming the left, believe that more Black representation in the police department is the key to ending white supremacy.
That 65% of Memphis population is Black. 58% of the entire police force in Memphis is Black. The police chief was a Black woman, right? And so on and so on. So you take all that in totality, you think, well, okay, well, where is this institutionalized white supremacy coming from, given the institution is actually served predominantly by Black people for a population that is predominantly Black as well? So I don't get that point.
That's really interesting because I didn't know that. I didn't know that Memphis had a predominantly Black police department and that it was run by a Black woman. But that does definitely throw a spanner in the works of the people who were arguing that if we had more Black representation within the police force, police brutality against Black people won't happen, because this is a police force that's predominantly Black and run by a Black woman. Yet despite that, they had one of the most brutal cases of police brutality.
Now, I wouldn't put it past a couple of chronically online leftists to say something like that, but that is not the argument that I see pushed in the academic world of leftists. What I typically see is ending systemic forms of oppression like the police complex in the United States would require massive overhauls of perspectives through better education and training that does not intentionally frame racial or impoverished communities as high crime, which they argue can only be done by employing more principles of socialism through better funded welfare programs and more holistic education. And yes, these structural changes do apply to majority Black areas as well, almost especially majority Black areas like Atlanta or Chicago. Because most school districts are funded based on property taxes collected from the districts that they serve, this ensures most heavily minority populated areas are consistently underfunded and underserved, considering Black and Latino people have the lowest salary households in the United States. Our local, state, and federal governments are all very aware how heavily minority populated areas are consistently underfunded, and nothing on a systemic or significant level has changed. Just because a police force is headed by a black person and has many black officers does not mean systemic racism will not and does not rear its head. Because last time I checked, the police are still limited by the laws they are allegedly supposed to uphold, and those laws in question in many ways target and disproportionately harm minority communities, like the criminalization of marijuana. Systemic racism is not an individual by individual issue as conservatives try to frame it as. It is a societal problem that we all continue to serve in small and sometimes large ways. All people, no matter what your racial or ethnic background is, are complicit in that system. This video spawned a number of things that I am interpreting as unmovable bias towards the left on Patience's part, including her reluctance to separate American and English systemic issues when it is convenient for her. One of her main criticisms about Noah Samsen was that he input his American political bias into something that she perceived as a non-political conversation. And yet, in a conversation that is inherently political because it deals with an institution set up by these states, she tries to separate the political from what she considers to be reality because the term political for her seems to only apply to anything that remotely touches the idea of identity politics. While I don't really care if and when the English comment on American-centric issues and political discourse, because I do understand how our systems are connected and how similar they are, I do mind when non-Americans refuse to acknowledge that they are interjecting their biased perceptions of their homeland or adoptive countries' political structures onto Americans. I mind when non-Americans attempt to speak on American race relations without much of a background in American history or politics. I am inclined to hear out a less formally educated American or a person who has lived in the United States for a considerable amount of time when it comes to politics because they have lived experiences that add valuable context. Non-Americans do not necessarily have to agree with the left's perspectives on race relations or systemic inequalities, but if you have no education on the topic and no significant lived experience here, what is it that you believe that you are adding to the conversation besides pompousness? In the absence of education or experience, the perspectives of most non-Americans in the United States are made up of extremist media and sparse individualized interactions with a particular kind of American, meaning the ones who are wealthy or fortunate enough to travel abroad. In some cases, I believe that non-Americans can spark excellent conversations regarding things like xenophobia and ignorance, or anything that Americans have done that directly impacts their nations, including a lot of our political discourse. But that is rarely the case for political commentator channels like Miss Zena. The point is not to gatekeep American political conversations, but it is to say, maybe leave more room for learning and actually try to understand what people are saying when they refer to systemic and systematic oppression in the United States, than just assuming that it has to do with purely excusing the actions of some from a particular people group. More importantly, and if not most importantly, this video showed us Patience's racialized frustration. This section is titled Racial Irritation, and it will come in two folds. One will be my speculation on Patience's racialized irritation, and two will be the removal of Patience's identity and personhood by the online left. Content like Patience, meaning content that is more conservative in nature, content that is less willing to extend grace to marginalized groups when it appears the majority group is being viciously attacked, and content that attempts to remove identity from the question. It is unsurprising, and it is even in most cases less surprising to me when it comes from a Western person who is of a marginalized group. When Patience denounces the reliance on the white supremacy talking point, there's a level of emotion that she rarely showcases unless it is regarding race relations. My speculation on both Patience and some marginalized people who lean right and showcase an obvious increased level of irritation towards the people groups they belong to is that they are just that, irritated. In the West, most marginalized groups, particularly racial minorities, are bombarded with so much, including blatant racism, learning what unconscious bias is, being told that you have to work twice as hard or be twice as good as your white counterparts to get half as much, being forced in with a people group that may not actually align with your individualistic values, dealing with the underlying desire to fit in with the majority group, and the overall desire to be seen as more than just your skin color. color by all. To some, these things may ring as internalized racism, but I think it is a more necessary path to self-identification and growth. Sometimes a marginalized community can become too communal, especially for those who operate on a more individualized scale. Suffocation within spaces that are supposed to be created for the in-group can be quite common. I think that this effect can be accentuated during times of heightened stress or emotion, which is quite the opposite from what many would assume. Community is said to uplift and connect, but it can also have a militant aspect of conformity, and for someone who is younger and less secure in their personhood outside of the group, perhaps this could cause some to intentionally break away from said group. Alternatively, it can lead to pure exhaustion and reluctance. When you are constantly told, whether it be at home, at school, by friends, by media, that your life will be significantly harder due to X uncontrollable factor, there is an exhaustion that settles on your shoulders at a very young age. It feels as though we're being tested daily, like anyone who sees us on the street or in the store is deciding our ideology for us. Some have made the painful decision to forgo aspects of their faith in an attempt to ward off assault. Others are afraid to leave their homes. I have lived a life praying it wouldn't come to this. I never wanted to believe that I am threatened because of who I am, but recent events have really made me think that I really don't belong in the land of my birth. This quote is from an essay published on NPR by Banish Ahmad on what it means to grow up as a Muslim in the United States post 9/11. It is a sentiment that I think anyone of any marginalized background can understand. The suffocation of fear or uncertainty when you meet someone new. You may not want to, but maybe you're questioning how they're already perceiving you. You may not want to acknowledge it, but maybe some of us have abandoned certain distinctions in our root cultures because we know how it can alter someone's opinion of us. That distinction can be anything: a skull cap or yarmulke, a hijab, a sari, an accent, a hairstyle. Being a person of color makes that action a little more complicated though. So what can you do? You can alter parts of your personality, opinions, and appearance to make it be the furthest thing from a racial stereotype, even if it's not something that is truly authentic to you. You can pretend as if you don't understand how perceptions of race still stifle people's ability to move as easily through society as white counterparts. You can do this in perceived good faith by half-heartedly acknowledging that struggle, all the while stating that there may be other, more important factors at play. And yes, this can lead to prejudices being formed. Essentially, what I'm saying is, who wants to be continuously burdened with thoughtfully thinking about society's interactions with you due to your systemic marginalizations when you can just dissociate from it? After all, maybe Patience hasn't actually experienced forms of racism that most Black people in the United States are accustomed to. Maybe she hasn't experienced generational trauma or poverty. There's an underlying thought that people like Patience have that all of their experiences in whatever group they are lumped into with must match each and every societal level problem often discussed, or else they don't exist. This is reductive and insidiously so. It is an attempt to retain a puritanical sense of individuality that none of us actually have. Sure, in my head, I'm a staunch individualist who blatantly rejects community in my personal life for reasons that have nothing to do with the groups that I belong to, but I also realize to a lot of people, I'm just a nigger. There's a line between the individual and society that Patience constantly tries to draw that will never truly be acknowledged by anyone who is not in direct interaction with her. That line is something that like-minded people like Blair White or the offensive tranny tries to draw as well, as in to say we are not in community because we share a singular commonality. And I do think that that's true, but people fail to recognize that that is not society's traditional outlook on them. And truth be told, it's not even the outlook that they or we share. Both Patience and Blair care enough to constantly talk about the communities they frequently reject because they know how the perceptions of those communities can impact them. And they also understand that the little power that they can levy against said communities could increase their likeliness of comfort within spaces that contain a large amount of opposition. So that's how I typically see people of marginalized groups who become very contrarian, very unproductive and acting as if they are dense. The balance I try to find, though, is not stripping them of their personhood. Even as I say, society does not tend to view individuals of marginalized groups in a similar fashion. We can acknowledge and reckon with the real sorrows within societies against certain people groups while acting against the grain individually. This is an idea that conservatives claim to have, but only see as far as they can shape and mold society to fit into the parameters of what they think is a respectable individual. And more progressive people are not immune to that very tendency. When a conservative or centrist person like Patience, a Black woman, opens her mouth to express her beliefs, there's an immediate stripping of that person by a lot of online leftists. Patience is no longer, as she identifies, a moderate Black English woman. She has now become a grifter with a bad weave. She has become a whitewashed Black girl, a foolish Black woman who bows to the opinions of her white partner, which is something that one of my own subscribers implied in the past. When you're speaking in the realm of politics, I understand the tactic of demeaning one's opposition, even though it is something that I am idealistically opposed to, and I am not simply opposed to it because I'm above a little bit of mudslinging. No. But because I see that it does not accomplish anything in the long run unless one is really willing to fully commit to bigotry, extremities, and lies. And that's not what the left wants to do, right? The reason why this type of removal of individualistic thought does not work for the left is not because it is mean or unempathetic. It is because it exposes that the left, in some spaces, can just as easily and quickly reduce a person to nothing if their ideas do not align. It shows that the left can weaponize identity politics like the best of them and blow racist dog whistles in the same respect as the right when it is convenient for them. There's a counter argument that is commonly brought up by the left against these kind of talking points that follow the lines of, we don't have time to handhold or try to reform low-key bigots. Fair enough. But don't be surprised when people see these actions in that way and turn away. To summarize, the left does not inspire feelings of trust in those who are not already deeply entrenched in its ideologies. This is not about defending or empathizing with Patience. It's about understanding how the left's actions largely mirror that of the right's, just in a different vein, and in turn acknowledging why the people in Patience comment sections that are going, I don't know about this, sis, still refuse to join the left, even though they are clearly showing a deviation from the right.